Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military science, science fiction contest. Reaction to the system on fire. Military science, science fiction contest. Stories every Wednesday. Military science fiction contest.
Welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. We are four veterans who are crazy enough to become writers, and we're here to talk about what makes great military SF, the greatest niche within a niche of any fiction. More niche than the con we're going to talk about today, Liberty Con, which is about a niche, science fiction, and only allows 1,000 people to participate. So that's super duper niche. On board is Rick Partlow, author of more than 60 novels, including Contact Front and the Drop Trooper series. Jeffery H. Haskell, author of the Grimm's War series. Josh Hayes, author of the Valor series. And I'm James S. Aaron, author of the Galactic Law series. So between the four of us, we bring more than 100 novels written. Most of that is Rick, of course. More than 30 years publishing experience. And on the military side, we'd be retired by now if we'd stuck around. So join our Discord server to tell us how much you love us. And as I was saying, today we're talking about LibertyCon because Rick and I just came back, but Jeff and Josh did not attend. So we're also just going to talk about cons in general, what we like, what we don't like, what you should look for. Should you attend them? Should you not? If you haven't written anything, should you go? Like, should you be, concerned that you're not professional enough or whatever?
I'll tell you, the one takeaway from cons in general that I think is the best value of a con is the meet and greet, the getting out there and talking to people, making contacts. It's a great way to meet people, to make contacts, even if they don't turn into business opportunities. That con, the repetition of meeting people and getting your name out there and getting people to know you. And half of this business, when it comes to working with publishers, and this is indie publishers, it's traditional publishers, is the publisher knowing that you're someone they want to work with. And so getting yourself out there, letting people know that you're easy to work with, that you're excited and passionate about what you're doing, is really beneficial to your career. All of my good deals I've made in the last 7 years have come from me showing up at cons and putting myself out there and talking to people.
And I would say too, if you see people, so at least here, the culture seemed to be that people were doing, hotel room parties. They would say like Chris Kennedy had a party. Don't assume it's just for Chris Kennedy authors. Like if they announce it at the intro, which they did in this case, go there and, meet people. Which
and let me give people another bit of advice. If you're going as an author, be humble. Doesn't matter if you go into a panel and think you know more than the people who are on the panel. Don't be coming up to them afterwards and trying to prove to them how knowledgeable you are on that panel, on the subject, because none of them care.
If you're not established and you're looking, like Rick said, to get on panels, or you're looking to get in with a publisher, or you're looking to have an in with like an author or something like that, the best way to not do that is go up and talk about your book. The best way to get in, and this is why I say it sounds counterintuitive, the best way to get in with a publisher or an author that's good with a publisher, or work your way into that group, is to just go in and be yourself and just talk about life. As authors, we talk about writing books all the time. And as nice as I am and as understanding as I am, I don't want to listen to your pitch for a book. I don't want to. And if you want to hang out and talk about, I don't know, Chiefs football or something, let's talk about that and build a relationship on something other than you just trying to
it wasn't one of your guys
read your
recently.
book. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I'll say as writers, get to know someone as a person, like where they come from, where they, just all those things that people do love to talk about themselves. So, but that kind of connection is so much better than walking up to somebody after the panel and trying to one up them on the amount of knowledge you have. Like,
know where you are in the social hierarchy, right? Because there is a hierarchy. And when you're talking to someone who's above you in the hierarchy, do not open with, let me tell you about this book that I'm writing. There's this really interesting character, blah, blah, blah. Nobody cares, right? Ask them about the book stuff they're working on, and then one day,
or better yet,
and you
tell
work
them
hard,
how much you enjoyed their book that you read.
You will be, yeah, exactly. You will be above the people you're talking to in the social hierarchy. And then at that point, if you want to tell them about your book, they'll be interested.
Yeah.
But people above you on the hierarchy are not interested in hearing about the book you're working on.
Or DHS, if you can do your research, talk to them about an author they like.
Oh,
like
yeah, definitely.
Some other author.
Make it about the person you're talking to, not about yourself.
Yeah.
What is military sci-fi and how it differs from science fiction that has people in the military in it, but aren't the main characters, right?
Yes. Well, we figured
this is a pet peeve of mine because more than half of what is in the military sci-fi section on Amazon and in the bookstores is not military sci-fi.
Well, why don't we start then? Give your idea of what military sci-fi is. Why don't we go?
Military sci-fi is about people in the military and how they deal with technology in the future and warfare and how it evolves. And it's pretty simple. If your main character is in the military and it's about them being in the military, then it's military sci-fi.
I agree with you. I think it's a story where the characters are in the military. I do enjoy stories that don't always have to be like about the experience of being in the military, which are pretty hard to find. Like, I think usually they're going to be tied, the question also, should it be tied around some kind of campaign or a battle or what? Like, I'm thinking of Battlestar Galactica in particular. Like, Battlestar Galactica is a good example, I think, of a story where most of the characters are in the military, but then you also have other outside characters. Like, that one's going to be almost cross-genre in that respect, where they can jump between and show different things about the military experience and then the civilian experience, outside of the military. First episode is so tense, where they're fighting, it
was so good. Yeah.
Military problem. They have to jump every, 7 minutes, or the Cylons find them, and they're using the tools that they have, which is, the Galactica being an old ship, like all those tropes there, which I think for me tie into great military science fiction. Like, that is the other thing. Like, you might not have the hottest, greatest technology. You have the tools you have, you understand how to use them, and you apply them to the problem, the situation at hand, which is the military problem, right? Which I guess for me, that would get to it, like the military problem in the story. And are we using, military methods to advance the plot and grow the characters and things like that?
An example of military sci-fi for me would be like the David Weber Honor Harrington series, which again, kind of like Battlestar in this way, you got a lot of predominantly military setting and operation and all of that, but you still, you could follow Honor in her personal life. There were other characters that you could follow doing things that weren't directly related to the military, which I think some
political machinations too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the combination of those, if used correctly in the right elements, still lend a book to being MilSci-Fi. With sci-fi with military in it, I've done that. I've done both. I've done military sci-fi and sci-fi with military in it. I think the readers of MilSci-Fi read MilSci-Fi for what it is and what they know that it is. The readers of sci-fi with military will read both, but they'll be a lot more forgiving, especially in the sci-fi with military in it, because in that,
well, they're reading it for different reasons.
Well, they're reading it for different reasons, but they're not as knowledgeable as, like, say, veterans or people in the military when they read something about a tactic or something about weapons or something like that. If they see that something is wrong or maybe not accurate, tactically speaking, they're not gonna immediately think that's not how they're gonna do things and then be disappointed with the book. A reader that is reading MilSci-Fi for the MilSci-Fi, if he reads a sci-fi book with military in it, he's going to see a lot of the things that the other readers won't, or he or she, and they'll be, I think, a lot more critical of that.
When you read military science fiction as opposed to science fiction that happens to have military people in it, I feel it's not as much what it's about as the mindset of the people in the book. I mean, there's, anybody who's been in the military knows there's a certain way you look at things, and you're looking at things differently than if you're writing a book and it's about explorers or politicians. If you're in the military, you see things as work that has to get done or threats that have to be dealt with. You're not going into things looking at it like Captain Kirk. I have to meet this new race and establish relations with them. You're looking at like, okay, this is a threat. How will we deal with this if establish relations? Yeah, I got that. How will we deal with this if we're attacked? You're looking at things in a different way. And I think if the main characters are dealing with things that way, then it's more military science fiction.
Today, we want to talk about hard SF and military SF, which came out of some conversations about what makes military SF different than space opera with military characters. This is a very niche subject if we're getting like super niche, but I think the thing that we kind of started off with is what really makes very believable military SF.
As long as people treat it the way military people today treat their equipment. The idea that, this isn't magic. You have to do PMCS on it. You have to clean it. You have to make sure that it's running right. You have to make sure your ammo is topped up. As long as you treat it like a military weapon and not magic, then I think that you're taking a step towards making it realistic military science fiction.
I tend to try to think in terms of it doesn't matter how advanced the technology is, you still got to deal with the people using it. And so if the weapon is too advanced, then your characters aren't going to have anything to do. They can just push a button and things will happen. And so I try to kind of constrain some of the technology so that it still requires character action, because I think that's the most important thing.
It's constraints and limitations that create drama, right? And so the more competent the character is, for me anyway, like one of the things I hate is when a character is incompetent in using a weapon. Like I like to see a character who is highly competent using a weapon, understanding its limitations, and as the author being very clear and setting up like what the capabilities and limitations are, like what the character knows about it. And there's always the learning process, and you can set up like with the training scene, like Rick was just talking about, you set up tension because we're teaching a person about the weapon. Now we can show the reader how this is working, right? And I think all those things work towards believability.
In Tranquility, they're fighting alien. They're kind of you could equate them to like the bugs in Starship Troopers, but I designed them more off of the Zerg from StarCraft, and so they're not using technology. It's just throwing meat at the grinder basically. But when you've got one mech and 100 alien creatures that are swarming you, the defense it kind of goes out the window. Like there's not a whole lot you can do. Like you can sweep your cannon around and blast a couple of them, but you get swarmed, then what are you going to do? And I came up with a total field, like electrical field kind of thing that they can hit as kind of a last resort that emits a like a high pulse energy field that shocks everything that's on them, but that also drains a lot of their suit's power too. And I like, again, I'm an over restrictor when it comes to that kind of stuff. But I really, really don't like giving my characters OP technology, and I probably place too much restrictions and limitations on stuff that they do, just because I think it's just interesting to see the characters overcome those limitations.
I'm looking at the technology that we have, and that's the hard thing about writing military science fiction, with the exception of things like superconductors and the power that goes into like the body armor, the battle suits, like these little isotope reactors. With the exception of that, everything that I'm writing is stuff that we're going to already have or will have within the next 10 or 15 years. I started writing that universe back in the late 80s.
Oh, wow.
And I was using every cutting edge thing that I could grab from any speculative fiction, aviation week and space technology, anything, and just stuffing it into this one book. And it wasn't 20 years later when we had a lot of that stuff, not all of it, obviously. We're not going faster than light or putting computers in people's heads, although that is coming now.
All right, today we're talking about rank, and rank in terms of, we're going to get a little how the sausage is made and talking as authors, but what rank means in a military science fiction story, how important it is, how authors should think about rank as it applies to character and plot progression, and then getting into any these days you get a contract, it's going to be 3 books no matter what, but quite often those 3 books hit and your publisher wants 6 books, 3 more books, and then 3 more books and 3 more books. So if you are designing a character to progress over the course of a series, how fast should you move them up in rank? And also, a general is not as cool to read about as a PFC in the trenches, typically. So I think that's a lot. So why don't we start with just rank in general, and maybe some thoughts about rank and how rank sets apart a military science fiction story, and maybe things people aren't thinking about when it comes to rank.
You spend a lot of time in rank too. I mean, I know I've read a lot of books where people have a tendency to, like, at the end of every book somebody gets promoted, or they jump them up in rank. But I mean, like, especially with officers, they're not getting promoted every other year. Let's see, it only took me 2 years to get to PFC, and then an additional year after that to get to specialist. But there was I knew specialists or E4s who took years to get to sergeant, and then a minimum of 2 years at Buck to get to staff. And so I mean, like, you got time to play. You don't have to speed through the rank progression. When you're writing with your military sci-fi, you really need to have a good grasp on what the rank is going to be before you get going. Like, what do you want this story to be about? Is this going to be an enlisted story? Is this going to be an officer story? I think the advantage to an officer story is you have more time. Officers just don't get promoted as fast as enlisted. So, you're going to be a second lieutenant for a while. You're going to be a lieutenant for a while. You're going to be an ensign for a while.
There's a tendency to make a lot of the main characters in a lot of these books Mustangs, because then you can start your series with them as a private and end it with them topping out at some rank like major or lieutenant colonel. Like Jonathan Brazie's, when he started out, the name of the book was Private. And Private, Corporal, Sergeant.
Yeah.
He went. That was the title of all the book. If you don't know if you're writing a longer series, do you want to top your character out at like corporal or sergeant at the end of your series? Because that works in the beginning, I believe, of a series really well, to give people a ground up, bottom up view of what the military is like. But if you get to like book 4 or 5 in a series, I think you want your main character to have a more big picture of the war he's fighting in.
Making, like you're saying, deciding on the rank that you're going to write about, you should know what all the ranks are capable of and how they operate. But if you're going to write a junior enlisted story, make sure that you're focusing on what the junior enlisted focus on, and if you're writing an officer story, make sure you're focusing on the stuff that the officers are focusing on, because they are significantly different.
I feel like you can do both, though. I mean, a lot of the stories I think would benefit from going from one to the other.
Oh yeah, like if you're having like multiple characters, right, and you're showing it from 2 different angles, 100%. Yeah.
I think it's interesting when there's both. When you see the officer and the enlisted, and they both think the other one is kind of short-sighted, but they're just looking at it from different perspectives.
I'm not super excited about staff, but there are ways that could be made interesting, or to have a character start as a staff officer or person on staff and put them. I mean, there are plenty of people in Iraq that found themselves in direct combat that were on staff, depending on what was going on. All right. So today we're talking about future military, like conceiving of future militaries that are relatable to today's readers, because it's cool to imagine the way things could be, and technology continues to change and evolve, but readers like to relate to what they know now for a satisfying story, right?
I try to stay as close to what is as recognizable as a military as possible, because you could invent your military from the ground up, but you're never going to do anything as good as it already exists. It's never going to feel like a real military if you just decide whole ham to, like, I'm going to come up with new ranks. First Globart, none of it's going to make any sense to people, and you're going to have to do a lot of work explaining things to someone who would rather you just said it's a first officer, than some other weird name that you come up with.
The major reason I think we use modern military as a model for structuring what we write about is that, one, it's simple, and two, it's relatable to the reader. And so they're not having to do the mental gymnastics to figure out what you're talking about. It's already there. It's that is what they know. It's just presented in a different context.
So that's another bone of contention for future military science fiction, is when we have starships, when we have space combat ships in space, will they be organized along Air Force lines or Navy lines? People who read military science fiction are very, very resistant to change, and don't want you to experiment, and don't want you to do anything different than
That's what I was going to bring up. I think people bring a certain level of nostalgia to it that they might be looking for. And when you start messing with rank, you're messing with their preconception about why they're coming to the story in the first place. They were a sergeant. They want to read about a sergeant. A lieutenant. They want to read about a lieutenant. That's the military structure. And I think you can, understanding it and using it effectively is really, it's when it's used poorly that it just detracts so much. But when it's used well, it creates those moments of like either victory or tragedy, or, you can really amp up. That's the kind of thing in a military story that won't be in other kinds of stories, especially where duty conflicts with maybe common sense in that way, but that's the kind of thing that, I don't know, it can be especially hard. Like if you don't set up those rules to begin with, like if you do I think if a reader is going to trust you, if they come into that situation where you've got either like a person of a lower rank who's in a much higher position that they shouldn't be in, or you walk into a command structure where there's a lot of, talking back, or maybe no talking back because everybody's terrified of the commander, like those are things that you can really play on if you know it and are doing it to a purpose. I think people get confused or don't understand when it's kind of a very generic sort of setting, and people start to like basically ignore anything else that's happening in the story because these details aren't right.
Stuff like that, like where you're flying through an asteroid field, maybe it's not realistic, but it's not gonna be something that's gonna pull somebody out of the story, like a really simple like misrank or misaddress or improperly structured kind of thing, especially in the genre that we're talking about here. And most of,
I think you underestimate the average military science fiction fan. I've been lectured because I got orbital mechanics wrong, or like I mistimed how long it would take a shuttle to get from low orbit to the planet.
That's why I never give people all the information. I give them expressions, not equations.
Exactly.
Well, and I think those readers are very few and far between. And I think the overwhelming majority of readers will be able to overlook something like getting the timing from orbit to the surface wrong. But if you get a rank or a type of address or a title or something like that wrong, they're going to burn you over the coals for it, because that's something that they're expecting and that they are really wanting from the genre.
Yeah.
Some people that's what they want is the.
I just want to point out, and I think you all should agree with me on this one, is that we love all of our readers who buy our books and spend their hard-earned money and time reading our stuff. And if they want to spend even more time figuring out that I did the math wrong, I appreciate that, because that means they really love the story. And you can't get that kind of engagement when you're writing this crap. So
for sure, 100%. Yeah, 100%.
I'm glad I gave you some kind of emotion. Today we're talking about death in military science fiction, and necessarily how you create stakes, how you give it meaning, should you drag it out, what's the best death that you remember for a character, how many people should your characters kill? Could you have a Star Trek military science fiction novel in a future where no one dies? Would that be interesting? So,
one, if they're going to die, make it meaningful, or if they're going to die, make it plausible. Don't just kill them to kill them.
That's something that's always bugged me, not just in Star Trek, but in some military science fiction, is that people that are not part of the plot die and nobody really comments on it. But if somebody who's part of the plot arc dies,
it's a big deal.
and everybody just
Yeah.
loses their crap
Yeah.
and cries and everything. Well, what about these other people who, although they're not part of the story you're telling, it's not unrealistic that these other characters knew them and were friends
Right.
with them and should have some kind of reaction to their death. I read a lot of military science fiction where it starts up with the enemy being faceless, non-inhuman, and then as it goes on, they learn more about them and they become more relatable. But, if they're not human looking, it may be a long time before any of the main characters decide, I don't want to kill them. If they look like bugs, it might be a lot easier for them.
Why not kill a bug?
Yeah, why not?
Just remember when you're writing these things that it's important to show the whole picture and to give us well-rounded characters to die. And when they do die, make sure the circumstances are meaningful or the death is meaningful. And it should impact the people around them or her, and not just be just a blip on the radar. Like they're fighting a battle that needs to be won. Then their death by its very nature is meaningful, even if it they weren't jumping on a grenade or whatever, just a random bullet killed them. At least they died in a meaningful battle.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it depends. Sometimes you're trying to make a point about the meaninglessness of
True.
Well, and I think that's something, both.
True.
I'm thinking of examples both Jeff and Rick have done where you'll have a battle in the midst of characters moving to contact, especially in space battle, where the distances involved or the volume of fire involved, like half the dropships get taken out, or the ship gets hit by a long range missile or something, and half these sections get taken out. And you're doing your job, especially in the case of Grimm's War, you're doing your job, you don't know what's happening around you, and these things happen, but the effect on the captain is definitely felt. And then later on, the effects on both Alvarez and Grimm later as they're processing these things is what gives the battle, gives the actions the characters are taking, gives them weight, and I think that emotional punch comes a lot later. I think that people come to military science fiction to feel justified in this is a story about justified war, doing the things that need to be done. And you're just going to make the reader feel bad if you beat them over the head with that.
Right.
But people should be real as well. This is serious business, and you should be serious. People should be serious about what they're doing. At least that's the stuff that I enjoy more of. I don't like Star Wars kind of things where we're just killing stormtroopers and they're falling off ledges, and that just has no real consequence. I mean, when they made the stormtroopers clones, it was even worse for me. So it was they don't matter at all. And then we make Finn we finally get to humanize the stormtrooper, and then he doesn't even matter. So that kind of thing just doesn't hit for me.
And it's never like Finn went on to try to talk the other stormtroopers out of their conditioning, and it's I'm going to kill them too, now that I got my armor on.
Yep.
There was so much they could have done with that character that they just
they screwed the character and the actor over big time.
yeah.
And the audience.
When we think about human nature and war being a part of human nature throughout our history, and maybe the ways that we've talked about this too, the ways we conduct war may change, but that as long as humans disagree about things, people are going to get killed. I don't know. That is the ultimate consequence. That is the ultimate expression of I want to do this and you don't. And having that have meaning, I think, is part of what these stories are helping people figure out. What that could look like in the future, or how we process it with what we know today versus what we imagine. I don't know. I think it's part of what military science fiction is doing.
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military science fiction contest. Reaction to the system on fire. Military science fiction contest. Short stories every Wednesday. Military science fiction contest.
Today, we're doing our first movie review, and we're going to talk about Aliens.
How Aliens, the movie, has affected, well, not only similar movies now, but also writing military science fiction.
Definitely influenced me.
I can think of several
what I
movies
mean
off
is,
the top
like,
of my head that are basically clones of Aliens.
As character tropes that were introduced in this movie that they weren't created out of whole cloth for this movie. These tropes have been around for years, and these types of characters have been around for years. But you got the gruff sergeant, you got the loudmouth private, you've got the confident corporal, you've got all the incompetent officer. Like, you've got all of these different tropes, and it's interesting to think about how they have affected almost all of military science fiction in terms of character generation and tropes that people are looking for. And that's the nostalgia aspect, right? Like, I think guys like us, our age group, the stuff that we're interested in, if you're reading military science fiction, Aliens is like the military science fiction
Golden
movie.
Goose right there.
And if you're reading characters that give you that nostalgic feeling from watching Aliens, that's even if the story's mediocre, the characters, if you do it right and they are like, oh yeah, this is like Hudson, or this is like Hicks, yes, I love this, or even Apone. It's crazy to think how many works that the movie has influenced.
I love the Colonial Marines, like Jeff. I couldn't get enough of that, and I've never ever been more disappointed by a movie in my whole life than I was by Alien 3. There was like Dark Horse Comics where the aliens went to Earth, and there was like this really cool story.
Michael, Hicks and
Hicks and Newt
the Resistance.
And Ripley comes back and they fight the aliens on Earth. It's such an awesome story.
They misunderstood what the audience loved about those movies. They thought it was the aliens and where they came from, and that wasn't what the audience loved about the aliens at all. It was the Colonial Marines fighting the aliens that was...
And Ripley being a badass.
And get away from her, you bitch. I mean, like every single... there's no other movie in existence where every single line is quotable. Yeah, he was the coward, so to speak, in the beginning. Like, we're all dead, that's just great, man, that's just great. But by the end of the movie, he's, you want some? Oh, you like that? How about you? It's just, that's one of my favorite characters of all time. Like, all the little things that make that movie feel real allow us to accept that alien, whatever he throws at us with the aliens, like the Queen and all that stuff. No one even questions like the biology of the aliens. It's not even really part of it. This isn't a man versus alien story. This is a man versus nature story. And nature just happens to be the aliens. And I think that's the difference between this movie and all the other aliens movies, is that all the other aliens movies aren't about the human aspect of it. They're about the alien aspect of it.
This podcast is for writing military science fiction. If you watch Aliens with your writer brain turned on and are paying, like, study it and see what they're doing, you could pick apart every scene and go, this is what they're doing in the scene. I need to work on this aspect of my writing, or this is what they did to push the plot in this direction. It's such a great masterclass in self-study for writing.
Just remember, we're writers, not directors. Yeah. So all the visual stuff in the movie, no matter how great it is, does not impact a novel. Right? It's the emotional journey of the characters and the story that really move a novel. People will come for the story, but they'll stay for the characters. And Aliens would not be rewatchable if the characters were flat and boring.
100%.
Doesn't matter how cool the effects are or how cool the machines are. It's the characters that draw us back every single time. So that's something to bear in mind when you're writing a book. Is it's the characters who do it, not the special effects of the story, because we're not making movies, we're writing books.
Today we're talking about landing on a hostile planet. Which is something that can be viewed from a lot of different points.
In Grimm's War, there's a couple of land on planets that aren't friendly in the sense of the people on the planet will shoot at you. And then there's one where it's land on the planet where if you land wrong, you die. Mm-hmm. And if you stay too long, you die, kind of thing. And then I was reading World War Mars, which is a Rick Partlow novel, his new book from Aethon Books. Really, really good, I might add. where the Russians are attacking the Americans on Mars. And it just got me thinking about different ways you could do it, because he handled it in a way that I wouldn't have. And I really enjoyed the way he handled it. So it got me thinking about landing on, either enemy or neutral planets. How would you land ground forces? What would be the challenges logistically, militaristically, all the other lees, to get from orbit or space to the planet? Also, I'm playing a lot of Helldivers, like a lot of Helldivers. I think I'm at 120 hours. And that's all about, dropping from orbit to the surface.
Well, and Helldivers does the classic
And
kind of Starship Troopers thing, right? You put them in a big bullet and launch them at the surface.
yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people think they got the name from ODST, which is the motto of the orbital drop shock troopers from Halo is feet first into hell. And so it's big bullet from orbit in a destroyer, and you get launched down and magically survive somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying there wouldn't be some kind of drop trooper type deal, from space. I know Rick does it in Drop Troopers.
Yeah, except they're drop in the sense that they drop from about 400 meters up from a drop ship. They don't drop out of orbit.
I mean, the thing that I think a lot of people don't think about, that I like it when an author gives consideration to it, is getting to the planet, and the fact that you need to think about that because your enemy can see you coming a long way off. And so how are you going to protect your invading force, either, through massive, numbers, or through, like we were talking about special operations last time, like through a small force that could potentially have cover underneath other things like shipping operations or logistics or something like that. I think you have to give that thought.
You're looking at multiple battles, right? You're looking at the battle to get to the star system. You're looking at the battle to control orbit.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're looking at the battle to control landing zone. And depending on the technology, some of those may just never be feasible.
The thing is, though, if your goal is simply to neutralize that planet as a threat, then you could nuclear bomb the heck out of it.
I mean, you don't even nuke it. You can just drop rocks on it.
Yeah, you could drop rocks on it. But if your goal is to preserve the habitat as someplace you can utilize for your own colonists or your own resource management, then you want to keep it usable, and you have to take it fairly intact. And maybe you shoot railgun rounds, that take out entire city blocks, but you don't drop rocks that are going to change the weather systems on the planet.
Well, that's what I think people got to remember from this conversation is like what the things that we're kind of walking through. I think when you're trying to come up with an interesting, exciting story, you could think of all these easy ways to fix it, but it's all about the problems that your characters have to solve, right? And they're trying to establish a military problem to reach an objective, but there's all the other things that get in the way that make the story interesting. Like I'm thinking about, like, even if you're trying to take orbit and hold orbit, radiation, solar flares, equipment problems. How is the planet trying to protect itself? Like they could be sending up the same, small operations forces to hit, if you've got some kind of sensor net or, all the different things you could do to make this interesting. That's what it's all about,
Also, you need to think of what's important to the reader, because they may not want to read all the down and dirty details of how you invade a alien planet. They just may want to read the story of this one guy or this one squad or a squadron or, flotilla or captain or whatever, and what's important in the war to them. Maybe you don't have to describe all of what happens invading that planet in your book. Maybe this is the end of the war for this person, and everything else that happens can be explained in a couple of paragraphs at the end.
Welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. So today we're talking about mechs and what makes a mech. What is a mech? Is it a Gundam? Is it a Pacific Rim type giant robot? Is it power armor like Rick's series? Is it like Tranquility that Josh has been writing?
Well, that's something we need to talk about. There's 3 different types of mechanisms that would fit into our current topic, and one of them is obviously mecha, which mecha is something like the Japanese anime BattleTech mechs, that kind of thing. And then you have powered armor or battle suits. Battle suits is like Starship Troopers, like Drop Trooper. Like, and in BattleTech they have the elementals that are that's battle suits. Battle suit is something that you climb into, but it's not something you pilot like a mech. It's something that you operate. You know, more like the exoskeleton that Ripley had in Aliens. And then you have powered exoskeletons, and that is what Jeff is talking about. That is like what we're developing currently, actually, for the military, is just something that allows you to carry more weight on your back and maybe carry thicker armor, but it's not a mobile weapons platform. It's just something that enhances your natural strength, and it doesn't, mostly in fiction anyway, it doesn't require like a fusion reactor. It's something that you wear so you can carry around heavier armor or a heavier weapon or like more gear.
That's a good point. And I think the constraints of the pilot, that's one of the things about, if you're going to have a human as part of this, you know, they're inside the weapon system. Like, now you got to deal, that gives you some good constraints, because you don't want to turn the human into mush if something happens. Like, they could still pilot it, or if it's augmenting them, you still got to deal with physics on their body and whatnot. As opposed to a remotely, you know, if it's just a remote weapon system, then you can do all kinds of different things with it, as far as you know, being mean.
Well, remote weapon systems, I don't include those when I talk about mechs, because basically if it's a remote weapon system, it's just a drone.
Yeah.
So with the Raptor suits I have in Grimm's War, yeah, they're powered exosuits basically. You climb into them, but you're not like,
you wear them.
Yeah, you wear them. They're 3 meters tall. Your legs go in their legs, your arms go in their arms.
That's the difference between a mecha and the others. Is mecha, you're like in the cockpit,
you're piloting
this thing that's a lot bigger than you, and the other ones, you wear them, and your arms are basically where your limbs, your body's basically just wrapped inside a lot of armor.
And you know, that's gotten them in, like, in the last book I wrote, like somebody gets their arm ripped off, and because the arm of the suit got ripped off and their arm was in it, and you know,
it's inconvenient.
Yeah, that is.
Well, you're dealing with, you know, physics still works, right? So if you're dealing with the more the increased strength of the suit, you're still squishy, so that could be really bad.
I got to borrow one of the best lines from Halo Reach, though, which was after her weapon got destroyed. She's like, "Well, I've got more mass than you."
I think that I did it in Tranquility, but the mechs are like loaded into racks on a drop ship, and then that drop ship would just fly down low, and then they could detach and either fall, kind of like Titanfall, where they're falling from the sky, but they've got like scramjets or jump jets on their armor, and they would slow their descent, and so they wouldn't crash land. But even though they do the little the superhero landing where they land on their knee and their arms out, and they're like, cha. But I like that, like seeing that visual is cool to me. So I would like I like doing stuff like that just for the visuals, but also because it explains how are you going to get really heavy mechanized armor into an area where you haven't secured yet. You don't have an airfield, you don't have anything like that. You need a quick deployment force. That would be something that it could be utilized for.
I have also used mechs as the replacement for tanks and a replacement for attack helicopters in different situations, and I've tried to make them as realistic as is possible. It's not really possible to make them too realistic, because mechs, when you come right down to it, are big targets.
So yeah, I mean, and if we want to talk about just straight up mecha, where you're like piloting it, you're in the cockpit, I love that stuff. I just don't write it. You know,
I love it, and I write it.
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military science fiction contest. Reaction to the system on fire. Military science fiction contest. Stories every Wednesday. Military science fiction contest. Discussion interviews, reviews Military science fiction contest.
Today we're talking about rank. So as soon as I said rank, it was kind of funny because everybody, I think, groaned inwardly. But rank is obviously a big deal in any military fiction or science fiction. And I think it gets even harder in military science fiction because you have to imagine a rank structure in the future, typically tied around the type of military force, the weapon systems they're using, how they're operating, what the culture is. I feel like that transition from civilian to private, or whatever you're going to call it, is something a lot of people can relate to. And it's just harder for people to relate to the lieutenant a lot of times, or even, that you get to like that break between officer and enlisted, and people just naturally don't like officers in a lot of circumstances.
I think it's easy for most science fiction readers to relate to like a brand new lieutenant just out of college who's lost and has everything explained to him. And that's a good tool for like explaining things, because you're dealing with a character who may not know the details of all the stuff that he learned in his OBC. He just knows the broad generalizations. So it's a good way to introduce your universe. And if you have a lieutenant, because private people are basically going to tell that private what he needs to know to do his job. But a lieutenant will usually get more explained to him about the big picture. So you could get details about the enemy and the war you're fighting that you couldn't if there's just some like E5 telling a private how to maintain his weapon.
One thing I really like is when you get the guy in engineering who's trying to fix the ship in the middle of combat, when you get like some perspective from his points of view. And I went back and I read a whole bunch of my military sci-fi books that I've read in the past, and I realized that something that almost all of them do is like, yeah, you've got the captain of the ship is usually the main perspective, and you've got, a couple of officers and, maybe the Marines. But there's always like a junior enlisted guy who that's like his first time on a ship, or you have like the engineer who is, just stuck in the bowels of the ship, and he doesn't really know what's going on other than the alarms are ringing and he's got a whole breach to fix or whatever. And so, yeah, I ended up doing that a lot, and it ended up being really like one of the best things I could have done. There are scenes in the books that are some of the best scenes, which are in the POV of somebody who you only really get one or two scenes from.
It creates tension because when you introduce this POV, you don't know if that person's going to immediately die. So that's sometimes something that when we jump to another, like whenever I feel that whenever you jump to another character that you haven't met before especially during a battle or something, like, okay, we need to get an outside view, another view on what's happening here. But now is the author setting their hooks in me? So I'm going to care about this person, and then they'll just get blown away, which works. You've got a built-in progression, and you have to follow, like, depending on what your, culture is, like in 18 months, you got to make, or even, 6 months, you got to make PV2. You could have come in as a PFC. Now you're going to be an E4, at least in the Army. There's kind of a, like, are you going to push on to E5? And all this stuff is like built in, and you can have characters push against that, or, they embrace it or they don't.
That's, I think the best thing about the advancing rank for a character is the added responsibility.
Right.
Because especially if your character is not used to being responsible for anyone but themselves, then putting people under them is a good way for to facilitate character growth. Because they may not care at all about these people. They may hate them.
Right.
But now they're responsible for them. So it's a good way to make them grow as a person, I think.
I like the whole premise of the first Grimm's War book, Against All Odds, is that Jacob has a limited amount of time to make lieutenant commander, or they're going to kick him out. Because it's not just enlisted that have this problem. The military doesn't like lifelong lieutenants. You're not going to meet no 70-year-old lieutenants.
Today we're talking about world building and future history in military science fiction. So the kind of stuff you hopefully are thinking about when you go into a military science fiction project, and how that is different than what other kind of world building you might do.
If you want things to be close to the way they are right now, as far as the military setup with Marines and Navy and, kind of a rank structure that makes sense to people reading now, it can't be too far in the future. because, you know, if it's 1,000 years in the future, well, 1,000 years in the past, we didn't have the military setup we have now, and I don't think we will 1,000 years in the future. So I feel like you have a narrow window for military science fiction if you want it to be relatable to people reading now, where you can get the technology that you need for a space war without the people being total aliens to us.
Yeah, I can't think of one of a great example of that is contrasting, like, for instance, the timeline of like Star Trek, right? Which the Next Generation is in like 2300 something, 24th century or something like that. And so it's relatively near future, right? Like a few hundred years. And so like all of that kind of correlates to modern day things. And then you contrast that to the Sun Eater series by Christopher Ruccio, which really isn't military sci-fi, but it's close. It's more epic sci-fi with military in it, but that's very, very far in the future. And
another interesting thing is when people go really far in the future, it always seems to me they wind up making their military and their government either the Roman Empire or some sort of medieval European nobility.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, like, Raccio really leans on Roman concepts, and which is
Ansbach and Cole's Galaxy's Edge. It's all very Roman-like.
Yeah.
No, yeah, true.
It's like Dune. Even I watched Dune again on Saturday, and just the whole idea of like space houses. I was like, thinking about like serfs and nobility, and you know, I was just like, they didn't really get too deep into it, but like it could have
people
got.
who live in space houses shouldn't throw stones.
Exactly, they should not throw atomics.
Been thinking about this a lot in the last couple of days because I've been doing a lot of world building over the last couple of days, and I kind of, when I first started writing, I fell into the practice or problem that Rick was talking about, where you world build just a crap ton of stuff before you actually write. And I would spend weeks and months, you know, building out fleets and then using one ship. And so what I do now is I don't build the stuff until I need it, right? So like I'm focused more on character and story and plot, and then everything else is kind of window dressing. It's the paint in which you tell the story. So typically, if I don't know that I need something, I'm not going to sit down and think about it. Well, now I'm working on kind of some of the backstory for the main antagonistic force in the Weaponized series, basing it on like modern day North Korea. I actually envisioned this world being like the most prosperous world of the original 8 expeditions that left Earth once faster than light travel was kind of invented. And they were very popular, and then a civil war broke out, and this dictator that kind of comes to power because of the civil war, there's a whole bunch of external kind of intergalactic corporations that are like making moves to take over like different elements of the planet's resources and kind of exploit them from their own. And this guy is like, no, this is our stuff. You're not taking it. And so he nationalizes everything. And after nationalizing everything, he decides the way that we need to protect this is we need a massive military fleet to make sure that this can't ever happen again. And so they end up becoming like a reclusive rogue state like North Korea, where they don't let anybody in, they don't let anybody out. Been doing that, and that again, that sparked this conversation and the idea of why your futuristic militaries or governments or nations do the things that they do and how they operate.
Is the dictator of your Star Nation going to sing "I'm So Ronery" at some point?
I'm so Ronery.
And today we're going to talk about a pretty common sort of criticism, I guess, that gets leveled at military science fiction, which is in a, you know, significantly advanced society, why is there war? Like, if people have figured out how to be intergalactic, if they have figured out laser beams and rocket engines, haven't they surpassed the need to use violence to accomplish their goals? But even then, as I say that, I'm thinking, like, is war always violent? Who knows?
Remember that your job as a writer is not to make the most believable scenario that would stand up to the War College and your doctoral dissertation. Your job is to entertain the reader.
Yes.
And they want to read about, space combat or Marines on the ground, and they want you to come up with a good reason why they're there. It's just good enough that they can not think about it while they're reading the book.
I think MilSci-Fi is, I'm sure there's a lot of genres that fall into this, but it's definitely a genre that leads really heavily into the rule of cool, regardless of technicalities or limitations or logistics or anything like that. It's the rule of cool. And as long as you can just a little bit, make it believable or understandable in the thing that you're doing, then the rule of cool rules all. I mean, it's key.
But yeah, there's lots of reasons to go to war, I think. And I think all the reasons we go to war today are still going to be relevant in the future. I mean, Fallout has that whole thing about war never changes. And it really doesn't.
It depends on whether or not your books have aliens or if it's just like human centric or whatever, because aliens are going to have a completely different logic system and like need and thought process than humans, and short from just like an alien invasion where the aliens just want to take over the galaxy or whatever, you can very easily come up with something that the aliens need that isn't necessarily a human need, but also it could be just that how many fights start out because people can't communicate, and the inability to communicate.
Ender's Game, right? Was the first in Ender's Game. The first Bugger War was about their inability to communicate. The Buggers thought the humans were just like them, and boy, and that's such a human thing, though, right? Like, how many fights have you had with your spouse because you just didn't understand?
So one thing I do in some of my books that are closer in time to the present, when they get into a conflict with a different interstellar culture, one thing that inevitably happens is that not everybody on Earth takes the same side. I mean, we wind up having to fight like the Russians or the Chinese or the French or somebody because they have their own plan that they want to use to take advantage of the fact that there's an interstellar war going on. So if you're dealing with two planets that both have multiple nations on them, that's going to make an incredibly complicated story, which I'm not sure a lot of people have the patience or the knowledge to write.
If you're going to write a longer series, you definitely need to have thought about these things, because it's very hard to maintain a series of battles or a series of conflicts if you haven't thought about the greater, like, why are they even in this conflict? I mean, I always love to have like the private who doesn't, knows Jack and is complaining to the lieutenant who maybe knows a little bit of Jack, and then the lieutenant goes to, complains to the company commander who's, probably tired and doesn't care. And like, I care about my sector, shut up and go do your job. But these are all things you can kind of layer if you've been in the military. It's always one thing to then take that, and they could all be watching a news report that shows it from the media perspective, which could be totally different than what they see on the ground. But the thrilling thing the reader came to read about is the actual like attacking an objective, which is totally different than what. So you can layer all these things, and then over time, if you have something bigger you want to say or how you want to come out of this overall conflict, those are all pieces you can play with, and having the background makes that easier, I think. So
I wish we could put little gifts in, because I feel like right now would be the perfect time to have that scene from Star Trek 6 where he's like, "We need breathing room," and Kirk is like, "Earth, Hitler, 1937."
Today we're talking about drone, and it's an interesting topic. Like I've used drones a lot in Aeon 14. And Rick, have you used drones that much in your series?
I use like observation drones. In most of my universes, armed drones aren't practical because of the electronic warfare capabilities, because I don't want armed drones in my universes. People like to have a stake in a story. They want characters who have skin in the game. And if you're sitting in a control room 10,000 miles away from the action, controlling a drone, I don't want to read about that, and neither does anybody else.
Mhm.
Drones are useful as like, for me in my books, is like showing you what's going on in one place or another, like reconnaissance drones. But I make a point in almost all my universes that I think is going to be echoed in real life, because it's already been echoed in simulations, that if you put AI in charge of autonomous drones, eventually they're going to kill either your own people or innocent civilians in droves, and then they're going to get outlawed.
The one thing that I find interesting about drones, especially in terms of near future or even present day stuff, is that the technology is so advanced right now that in a way that most people aren't aware of, that when they read it in modern day fiction, they're like, this is science fiction. And the greatest example of that right now is Mark Greeny's recent book, where a lot of people are saying this is more science fiction than actual, like what he normally writes, which is just mainstream kind of modern day spy action thriller, because he has an AI controlling weaponized drones, either the quadruped drones, like the dog thing. There's a video going around with the flamethrower deal. Yeah, that was in his book. Of course, they had
Did the dog have a flamethrower in his book?
No, they had basically like M40s, I think. Not M40s, 249s, like a squad automatic weapon almost, mounted on his head. Yeah, but it was the high caliber version. I think that's the 240.
The 240, yeah.
Yeah.
240.
And then he also had like swarms of smaller drones that were like quadcopter-ish, that some were observation and some were like they had explosives mounted on them and that kind of thing. And that is very real. Those things exist. They are used. And I think it's funny that a lot of people are like, this is science fiction, this doesn't happen. I'm like, no, it's happening right now. I would really like to read a book that do like drone combat well. And I don't mean like drone assisted combat, but like drone combat where the drones are the ones doing the fighting, and see how it can be done well. Because I can't think off the top of my head that I've actually read one where...
There was one that I read by Michael Stackpole called War Strider, I believe was.
Okay.
It was kind of like that. It's like the late 90s, so it's been a long time, so I don't remember everything about it. But it did it pretty well up to a certain point. But I don't tend to like those books. If I can come up with an excuse, or the author I'm reading come up with an excuse why there are no drones at all, I'm happy with that too.
I feel like it ties into a pretty basic fear we have about technology in general, right? Like being an overwhelming force that's inhuman that we can't fight. And so how, I think that's it's pretty high stakes depending on what people are going up against. But I also think like one of the things we've talked about is like, that seems like an easy button for the enemy. And so how are you going to like have that hit reality when, the drones are really like hitting the environment or things of that nature? We're talking about how we transition from the military to writing military science fiction. And I think for a lot of us, when we first started talking about this is like, well, we went into the military still as writers. Josh, I don't know that we've talked about it specifically, but I think it was the transition to writing MilSF through that. But Josh, I'll put you on the spot since I haven't heard your answer. Do you want to talk about where you started writing and how you transferred, how that fit into the military or afterwards?
I started writing before I joined. I wrote my first completed story when I was 14. And I think maybe my story is kind of similar to a lot of other writers, is I wrote and then didn't write. And I think a combination of two factors pushed me into MilSci-Fi. One, I liked military and I liked science fiction. So it kind of like blended together almost by default. But also, and I'm not sure... when I say this, I don't mean it as a cop-out, and I don't mean to say that military science fiction is the lesser of the two, but I also wanted to write realistic military fiction, but I didn't want to get anything wrong. and I was terrified of getting things wrong. And so in my mind, some of the bonus of writing MilSci-Fi was it didn't matter because I was making it up anyway. I couldn't get it wrong because I was making it up.
And yet people will still tell you get it wrong.
Right, exactly. And you know, it's just one of those things where you can, it's a, I don't necessarily say it's a small niche genre, but it is a niche genre that has a very dedicated following. And if you can do it well, then you're going to succeed in the genre. And I think that as far as niche genres go, it's probably the biggest. Right?
Is it more niche than the Coast Guard?
Well, I mean, like you talk about like weird westerns. Like there's a lot of people that like weird westerns, but that niche genre, the reader audience.
You say a lot, but you mean like 10.
Yeah.
I like weird westerns.
I do too. I love them.
The people,
but the audience isn't there. But there's a MilSci-Fi kind of falls into a weird thing where you can, if you're looking for MilSci-Fi, you're going to get it. But if you're looking for sci-fi and not necessarily MilSci-Fi, you still might like it. You know, I think even people that read regular military fiction would find something to like about MilSci-Fi in most cases. So it is kind of a cool niche genre, but it kind of has its place in multiple classifications.
We actually really were lucked out too, because like we're coming to the end of a 23 or 24-year period of people who entire generations that were in the military, and now they're coming out and they, you know, like us, there are things about the Army and the military in general that you miss when you're a civilian. There's obviously things you don't miss, but one of the things you miss is that sense of purpose and camaraderie. And you know, we write about that, and that's, you know, enjoyable.
I think there's also a strong feeling of, and this is a thing that always like, that I love. I mean, I love about the Army, like most, or the military, I should say, is like most people join because they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. They want to do something that is important. They would like to maybe not change the world, but just be part of something that's going to do something, right? And not to get too much. I feel like this is a pretty common sentiment among veterans, but you know, we did what our country asked us to do, and our country sent us to do some things that were pretty rough, you know, and people aren't happy about that at this point. And the way those things turned out. And military science fiction gives you an opportunity to kind of take those same sentiments and put it in a, you know, just a better situation. Like you can feel better about what you did, what they did, those characters did. You have time to explain or be there with the character, why they're making the decisions they make. You know, when you're in a situation where all you're doing is, you know, being a mushroom, you know, stuck in the dark and fed crap, like you don't know what the general's thinking. You don't know what what command is thinking or fleet is thinking or why they're doing the things they do. And military science fiction can give you the opportunity to kind of look at that from all levels and also do it in a way that is, you can feel better about, you know, a story that you can, I don't know, feel good about, I guess.
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military science fiction contest. Reaction to the system on fire. Military science fiction contest. Short stories every Wednesday. Military science fiction contest.
All right. Today we are talking about humanitarian missions, which could be outside the realm of what you might expect from normal military sci-fi, but it's something that if you spend any time in active duty or were in the National Guard, you probably did something related to a humanitarian mission, a civil support mission, something that was outside the realm of your mission.
But yeah, we fought fires and we transported people and we rescued people, and it was awesome. It was like one of the most like wholesome kind of things that you can do in the military. is go to a natural disaster area and clean up and help people. And and there's who better to do it than 19, 20-year-old kids who could march forever. Like, hey, go up into the mountains, 30 miles and go fight fires up there for 8 hours and then come back down. It's like, sure, that's easy. I've been through basic training. What are you talking about?
It's better than mopping the parking lot when it's raining.
Exactly. I mean, being able to do a cool mission, serving your country, helping out people that are actually your fellow Americans. I mean, it really doesn't get much better than that.
And I was watching the videos coming out of North Carolina, and the Army guys they're all over it. Watching them airdrop hay onto cows was just awesome. And so to bring that to around to writing in military sci-fi is that I try to sneak in a subplot every once in a while of the Navy, the Alliance Navy or the Alliance Marines doing something that is not war related,
right?
That is, shows that, because a lot of times people get caught up in this idea that the military is the military and they just fight and they train to fight and blah blah blah. And they don't do anything else, and it's good to remind people that no, there's lots of aspects of the military service that isn't fighting. And that's good to have that in fiction too, because people will forget it.
Well, like we've talked about before, it gives a lot of depth to the writing, and for the people that don't know, it may be like, oh, this is neat, and for the people that know, they'll respect you and give more credence to the story you're telling just because they know that that's true. It's the thing that happens.
And natural disasters are going to happen.
Right.
No matter where. No matter what time period you are. I mean, fires are still going to be fires. Earthquakes are still going to be earthquakes. And I mean, I'm sure you could cite some reason why earthquakes don't affect cities, but I don't find that particularly realistic. And I got an email recently where the guy's like, I don't find your technology plausible. And I was like, well, it's all based on real science. I mean, it's real stuff. Some of it's, some, and I inferred some things from the science, but I'm like, it's all 100% realistic. And he's like, oh no, it's not that I don't find it realistic. I just think 1,000 years in the future they would have much more high-tech stuff.
Sure.
And I was like, yeah, but I mean, I put a disclaimer in the back of the third book saying, like the whole reason the technology is the way it is because I wanted to keep everything relatable to the characters and to the readers. Also, I don't really go into the history of the galaxy, so you don't really know what happened. There might have been some sort of
Butlerian jihad.
Yeah. Well, and I actually do talk about how they don't use advanced computers because they're too easy to hack, and that everything is hard coded on firmware.
Today we are talking about
enemy ships from hacking your computer systems. The code can't
story as a way to a lot of times set up a problem and then refer to it later in the book, is just a great way to bring about like character resolution and things like that. So
it's almost a trope in a lot of Space Marine type series, especially to have boot camp, basic training to start out there.
I don't know. There's only so many times that I can read about that. And I don't know if that's just because I write it or because I lived through it. But if I'm reading MilSci-Fi, for instance, reading like Grimm's War, I don't need to know their struggles through basic training to follow their story as naval officers or ensigns or ratings or whatever they are. And I know fundamentally that they all went through basic training. I know they went through that experience. So I don't necessarily need that for the story. But if there are events in their training that affect them later on, or like you said, set up something else that happens in the story, then I could see it being important. I can't remember. There was a story that I read. Was it Old Man's War? Have you guys ever read Old Man's War?
Mm-hmm.
Old Man's War, I think they had a sequence where they were doing some kind of training. And it was.
I read one book by Scalzi and I hated it so much I just decided not to ever read anything by him again.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's not my favorite, but I remember it taking up a portion of the book and just wanting to get past it to get on to all the rest.
I'm trying to remember because in Old Man's War they put them in the new bodies, right? So that felt like that was a big part of it, was the transition to the bodies,
right? And
I
that's
feel
true.
like that was why he did that.
Yeah. And like in Starship Troopers, well, I haven't read the book, but in the movie, you know, the sequence of the training, there's some things that happen in the movie, at least during their training, that affect what happens later on. And it also, before they join it, they're setting up things that happen later on. So if you're doing something like that in your story, then I could see it working well and necessary. If I ever use anything like a basic training setting in my books, it's like he remembered in training when he was doing this and his instructor was pounding into his head, do this.
I actually think I have a scene like that too, where Jacob remembers something about the training. I didn't really want to go into it just because like my main character is an officer.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of anything more boring than officer training school.
I don't know about that. I mean, I made a point in Drop Trooper about officers training that I don't think gets ever brought up in military science fiction, and I thought it was kind of funny. When his commanding officer asked him what the most valuable classes he got in OCS were, and he was like, finances, how to invest my money and have like a life after the military. Because I had no idea. I was a street kid in the underground of the city, you know.
Kind of like the Kobayashi Maru thing. I like to set things up in the mission when they go sideways to give them to foreshadow that a little bit in training. So when they come up with a plan in the middle of everything, it's not like a Deus Ex Machina where they're like, oh, let's do this, but something if you can set up either a failure or a kind of a unintended thing that happens in training, they can kind of use that in the real world scenario. They already have the background knowledge, which they probably would anyway, but this just gives the reader that kind of anchor point to say, oh yeah, this just didn't come out of nowhere. I can see where this came from.
I actually did that with the last two books. They were kind of a two-parter, a Grimm Decision Grimm Decision and Traditions of Courage. In the beginning of Grimm Decision, they're doing a training exercise, and the way Jacob loses the training exercise is the way he wins the final battle.
Right, that's right. I remember that.
And it's good to bring that together because it bookends it, you know, so people feel like even if they don't realize that the ending and the beginning are matched.
And if you really want to encapsulate military training, you have to have a PowerPoint, and that PowerPoint has to have every single word that the instructor says on a line in the PowerPoint, so the instructor can read the PowerPoint.
And also, if it ain't raining, it ain't training.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. Today, we are stepping into new territory with our first guest, beloved romance and cozy mystery author, Richard Fox.
Richard Fox is here to speak of battles fierce and victories bleak. On MilSFPOD, grab your seats. Galactic wars, warriors now treat. We're all through with the soldier's heart. Tales of courage, he brings to life. The light, second tactics play their part. In our universal endless strife, Richard Fox is here to speak of battles fierce and victories bleak. On MilSFPOD, grab your seat. Galactic war is now treat.
Hi, gentlemen, and everyone listening and watching. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. And it's always great to see such friendly faces. I am, as I said, I'm Richard Fox. I am a science fiction writer, predominantly military science fiction, though military science fiction, space opera, those tend to blend a lot for me.
For the viewers that may be trying to get a start in MilSci-Fi and or maybe have written a couple of books, I would hesitate to say you're the godfather of the new MilSci-Fi, but you definitely put it on the map in some aspects. What would be your your advice to a brand new writer, or even maybe a writer that's written one or two books in the genre that are really looking to up their game, what would be your advice to them in terms of writing?
Yeah, read the genre. Read everything you can that's popular in the genre. And so that way you kind of know, if you realize here's all the, like, there's 10 things that work in military sci-fi. And if you can like pick out most of those things, then you know what the reader's like. And you guess what? Like, if you're going to write military sci-fi, it's like opening a pizza restaurant. You got to serve pizza. Okay, you open a pizza restaurant, people come in there like, it's just cheeseburgers today. You know, no one's going to be happy with that. So look at, you know, what makes the genre work, and then give readers what they expect, and then give them a little bit something extra.
Right.
You know, you got to give them enough something to go, oh, that's interesting.
The same
And then
but
you
different.
keep them engaged. If you give them the exact same story that they've read a million times, they're going to bail on you like a third of the way through. But if you got to have, just give them some sort of twist, a little bit of extra flavor. So now it's you know, it's a pizza, but the toppings are different. Oh, this is the artisanal pepperoni. If, you know, for everyone out there who's into military sci-fi, and you're thinking about writing, and all of a sudden all you've heard me is, you know, referring back to my time in the service. You don't actually have had to have served to write good military sci-fi. I always bring up Tom Clancy, who was a real estate agent, but wrote amazingly good, very accurate.
He's an insurance salesman.
Yeah, excuse me, real estate agent.
Okay.
David
And
Weber as well was not in the military either. So,
Yep.
and he writes fantastic MilSci-Fi.
Yep. And the thing is that both, well, at least for both of them, they just did their research. They went to the library and did their research. So there's all sorts of, material out there for anyone to be able to write this stuff.
You don't even have to go to the library anymore.
Oh yeah, even not even that. It's so I had to do 4 years of military college, 2 deployments, and then 10 years total in the Army to get to this point. And I would much rather just be able to let me just go to my normal YouTube channels and then pick up everything, because then I still have a good back and knees and shoulder and all the rest. But
Right.
Not service related, Richard. You know that.
Today we are responding to a listener question, and all around cool person, Burn Enough. I don't know their actual name. Super fan, who has also been making some really neat sort of paraphrasing videos. I don't know what you would call, I guess, remixes
Clips
of the shows. Yeah, clips. Just really cool.
I met
Why are you swinging around?
Josh and I were selling books at Dragon Con the year before last. There was a young woman who came up and she was looking at books, and her boyfriend was there and he was buying all the lit RPG books. And I asked her, I was like, do you read sci-fi? She's like, I don't like the military. And so I said, well, did you like Lord of the Rings? And she's like, oh, I love Lord of the Rings. And I told her, I was like, well, have you ever seen the behind the scenes stuff where they talk about how they all have the tattoos and they're all friends for life now and they still meet each other? And she's like, oh yeah, that's so great. I was like, that's military sci-fi in a nutshell, is camaraderie, and she got this look on her face like, I never thought of that before. I thought it was just people shooting people and, loving the military, and loving war. And I'm like, I've never met anybody who fought in a war who loved war, but there's a difference between love and war.
Most people who are in the military will never tell you they love the military.
Well, I'm thinking about at the Emerald Con that we were at, Jeff, where the fan came up to you and had they'd made a framed poster out of all the covers from your superhero series from Wraith, right? And
I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's right over there in the corner.
Yeah,
nice.
I mean, it was just the coolest. It was very cool.
Yeah, it was. No, hell no. Yeah, it's a tad bit embarrassing just because someone's like heaping praise upon you. But I imagine if I was like couldn't leave the house rockstar famous without people following me in cars with telephoto lenses, I'd probably hate that. But we're authors, and if you ever watch the TV show Castle, in the very first episode, he's in this bar, there's a party going, and girls are coming up and going, oh, sign my chest. And yeah, that never happens.
Doesn't
That's
happen.
not a thing for any author
Rick
ever.
has to chase a lot of people off. Like a lot of those 50-year-old white guys want him to sign.
Yeah, buddy.
That is not a thing for any author ever.
I mean, that's the thing. Unless you're like George Martin, right? Like no one knows who the authors are. Like even like the big name authors that are right now, unless you follow them in their genre, you wouldn't know them. Like I know
Yeah.
people that don't know who Brandon Sanderson is. I know people that don't know who Mark Greaney or any of these guys that are New York Times bestsellers, and they're huge names in their fields.
They're big
If you don't
names in their
follow
field,
that
but they're
book-
not household names.
No.
There's only
Yeah,
the
for
only
sure.
author I can really think of. The only two authors I can really think of that like if I met somebody who had never heard their names, I'd be shocked, and that's Stephen King and J.K. Rowling.
Yeah.
And in this series, the Chinese and the Russians are very clearly bad guys. And at the time, because I started this series in like 2019, I got all kinds of criticism from a few reviewers for being xenophobic and painting the Chinese and Russians in a bad light. And of course, everything that happened since then, it's like,
They do it
I
to
was gentle.
themselves.
Yeah, I was too gentle with them.
Well,
They-
even in current like real time,
Mhm.
at this moment in time, people look at the Russian-Ukraine conflict and call the Russians the bad guys, right? Let's just say they are. I know for a fact that there's millions of Russian citizens that are not bad
Right.
people,
Right.
right? And so you can have an antagonistic nation state that is the bad guy in those terms and still have good people. It's just the same way in World War II there were good Germans. I mean, specifically when it comes to like YouTube channels and reviews, I mean those things are really, really cool. And we said at the beginning of the show, but if you haven't checked out Burn Enough's channel, it's really nice. He does a really good job kind of putting together some clips from our show. He's done lots of great reviews on Rick's books and his series. I love that kind of stuff.
I love his opening animation for his little compilations and his links below. And while you're down there, hit the like and subscribe button.
I like how you did that. It was very
Yes.
natural. I liked it.
I'll try to insert some goofy graphics. Where can we get that? Stuff.
If I had more money,
If
I'd
we
just
don't
pay
do it,
to be
Burn
on
will.
I know.
And Josh, I question if you can call yourself a MilSci-Fi fan because you've never read Starship Troopers.
That's the rules, Josh. We don't make them.
Yeah.
It's just the rules.
That's going to be an ongoing
Today could
meme,
be
I
the
think,
day.
in our.
Until you read it, yeah. Today we are talking about invading a planet, the resources required to do it, and how it escalates over time. So we're going to start with proposing an invasion of a civilized planet using technology level similar to what we all write in our books, which means no, neutron bomb that immediately wipes out all life on the planet and we just walk in. Basically you got to land troops, you got to control the orbit. And we're going to go from a place of how can we take this planet and maintain the civilian population all the way through, okay, we're done with these people now, and it's just time to drop some stuff on them. They have left around, now it's time for them to find out. The first mistake of any military force moving into an area could possibly make, which would be to underestimate the enemy and say, oh, they're not a threat because they have bows and arrows, or they're not a threat because they don't have, electron guns or whatever.
Well, they're still going to be battling, logistics, terrain, time, what the mission is. We kind of talked about, like, and the natives, I think, as they come, like, you're right. That's the first thing often these people make is thinking, natives or folks of lower tech are stupid. They're not stupid. They just have lower tech. And so they're going to look immediately for ways they can exploit whatever advantage they have. Be it, understanding the terrain, watching how the enemy operates.
In military sci-fi that we're discussing, like, what's the reason you're invading the planet? Like, why are you going there? And that can affect how you approach it. If you're going to harvest resources, and obviously you're not going to want to nuke the planet and shower it in radiation and
Just to be sure.
biological and chemical agents, right? If you're going for like a specific thing, I don't know, the Fountain of Youth. If there's something there that you're going for, you need to be extremely careful about how you approach it.
So you got to have a reason why people care about what your troops are doing. And so that was, for me, a Grimm decision was about building up why you should care about these people on this planet, even though ultimately some of them are bad. And then why you should root for book 7 is why you should root for, the freedom of this planet and fighting this big corporate battle. So, the motivations behind everything is really important.
I think in terms of making the reader care about what's going on, a lot of that can be super granular too. When you talk about in a grand scale, we cared about what happened during World War II, for instance. But you watch Band of Brothers and you care way more about what happened to that small company. And not that you didn't care about the millions of other men that lost their lives during the war, but you were much more personally connected. And so if you've got a big scale battle like that, sometimes you can get lost in the weeds a little bit by, going from major conflict to major battle to major engagement or whatever. And then the reader kind of loses connection with the people that you're following the events through. And that's what I'm saying. Like if you have multiple engagement areas, that can get really kind of complicated to write if you're not focused on it.
In an interstellar situation, I think how closely we adhere to the ROEs and how quickly we throw it out the window, it will depend a lot on how fast our communications are. Because if communications only go as fast as the next ship to come in, well, then whoever's in charge in that system is going to say, the hell with it.
They're in charge of the system.
Yeah. And I'm gonna do what I have to do to win this battle, whether or not I have to wind up killing a bunch of enemies.
And facing the consequences down the road. Yeah, I'm with Grimm's War. That's how it is because they don't have FTLC. They just have ship packets. So they send a message and it goes to a ship, and the ship goes to the next system and sends that message on, and so on and so forth. So oftentimes Jacob finds himself in a position where he is the highest ranking authority in the system, and he has to make decisions based on what he believes is best for the people of the system. And sometimes that means he stands in front of a review board and has to explain himself as to, well, why did you blow up the ship? Or why did you do this? Or why did you do that? Which is why it's so important if you write military sci-fi to read history and to read other military sci-fi, especially the great works like Starship Trooper, Josh.
Yeah. One of the things that we talk a lot about is what is military science fiction, what makes great military science fiction. But let's talk about the future of military science fiction. What do we think it's going to look like for the next wave, the next 10 years, 15 years of military and science fiction? And maybe we could start by, where do you guys see what have been past major movements of MilSF?
Yeah, J. Allen, I think it was the first military sci-fi I remember reading, and it was, far future, guys with, high-tech armor and guns fighting aliens. And so I think you can always look to the past to see what's going to shape the future. And, after 20 years of infantry action and I think there's a lot of room for the future of military sci-fi for more. I know we always joke about the niche within the niche, even though it's the largest niche in sci-fi. I think there's a lot of room for more tangential, works.
60 some years now since Starship Troopers came out. And it's powered armor, infantry, drop trooper type deals. They're still popular. So I'm not sure that there's any sea change coming, because it hasn't really changed that much since then. I think that fleet type novels really took off about the late 90s when David Weber started writing, Honor Harrington. The fleet style novels took off with David Weber, and they've had a popular following, just like your Grimm's War has shown. But I feel like, as far as the number, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I'm not an expert on that, but
I'm not sure you can get the numbers.
I feel like if I looked at the percentages, that the infantry ground troops have a greater percentage of military science fiction in the last 40 years than fleet.
Well, everything
stuff.
we've fought has been infantry. It's like when I think about the types of readers that might have been really drawn to Honor Harrington, probably served in the Navy. And, still plenty of people serve in the Navy, but it doesn't get the kind of focus it did coming out of World War II. And maybe that could be something that will change. I mean, the Navy's been a huge part of current operations, but they don't get the same love, I guess. We've talked about how drones aren't, super exciting to write about, but things like that will play a much bigger role going forward now that we're seeing them actively on the battlefield.
I mean, first and foremost, they got to be human stories.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all fiction. Nobody relates to a drone unless the drone is essentially a human.
Like Vola.
Like Vola or the Galaxy's Edge guys wrote a really great story called Tin Man. It was a short story that I thought was really good. I think readers accept there's a certain level of suspended disbelief on future technologies when it benefits the story. So yeah, you can have AIs run everything, and you can have robots, and you could have complete 100% automation, and your entire book could be two guys in a room, looking at pictures of people they're about to kill with the drone. Exciting stuff.
But being brutally honest, there's not a hell of a lot of space left in MilSci-Fi period at this point, because the market is very saturated. Because this started back about 6 years ago,
right?
7 years
Everybody blames
ago.
Chris Fox.
Yeah, Chris Fox gave military science fiction as an example in his book Right to Market about a market that was underserved.
In Chris's defense, he specifically told people not to do what he did.
I know, but I'm just saying that's when it started, and it's taken quite a long time to get this market, because it is a very popular market. It's taken a long time to get it saturated, but I think it's pretty close to saturated at this point.
Unfortunately, it's not saturated with bestsellers.
No.
Today we're talking about what military science fiction writers get wrong.
There's something happening, whether it's a battle or just a contest of wills or something, and the way that the good guys or the protagonists get through that isn't because of their skill or talent. It's the ineptitude of the bad guys. And it's what I like to call the easy button, where you put your characters in a situation and maybe you hadn't completely thought about how to get them out of it, and so you just nuke the planet from orbit because it's the only way to make sure. And
that was easy,
right?
Yeah.
Why do we do this every time?
You move on.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of our experience, I believe, and resource comes from like movies like Aliens, like you mentioned, Rambo, The Terminator, like all of these, like, for us, classic movies that we've watched over and over and over and over again, that have really kind of they were the baseline for our writing. And there was a time, and I think it's still valid now, where a lot of people were basing all of their war novels off of World War II, even if they were far future in the future, or even Vietnam.
Something else I want to get into.
I hear a lot of the advice from authors are to read the classics, like read the sci-fi books that were big and all of this, and everybody says if you're going to write fantasy, read the Lord of the Rings. Well, I think sometimes people take that to like the nth degree and don't consider all of the new current upcoming books that are out that really kind of change the paradigm, and they are coming up with new ideas, and obviously there's new technology, and they're based a lot of these writers that I think are making kind of hindering themselves almost is they're reading the classics, they're remembering these movies from the 80s and 90s, and they're basing a lot of their writing and their stories and their plot structure on those books without taking into account it's 2024 now. It's 40 years after some of these books, and
that's the thing. Like you said, a lot of writers, especially back in the 60s, were fighting World War II in space,
right?
And then you got into the 70s and 80s, and they were fighting Vietnam in space,
right?
And that's one thing that you have to take into account. Even if you want to write Vietnam in space, you're gonna have to to not insult your reader's intelligence, you have to come up with a good reason why. How come all these technologies we have now are not at work in your Vietnam in space? How come there's no
100%
weaponized drones? How come there's no satellites giving you constant feed of what's being? You have to at least explain that, even if you wanted to go that route.
Well, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons what I like to recommend is people that want to write MilSci-Fi today, read the current modern day fiction.
Or even read nonfiction about
that too.
WOT.
Read present day current events and either fiction or nonfiction, because I think you would be surprised if you haven't read those to see what the technology actually is present day. Because there's
read up on the freaking Ukraine war and see what they're doing.
Yeah, there's just so many
science
more
fiction.
Right. I mean, there's so many more technological advances that are around right now.
Imagine thermals in Vietnam. Like
oh my
that would
God.
Agent Orange, like everything, and this gets back to choices, right? But you think about if we had thermal technology in Vietnam, would we have dumped so much Agent Orange on the country?
Yeah.
And Agent Orange was like a huge tactical impact as far as how we're going to use it, how effective it actually is. All right, today we are talking about things that no one told you as an author, or that you would need to do as an author. We're kind of going into how the sausage is made a little bit, but we were just discussing how we could maybe tie this to MilSF, because there are definitely some specifics for this specific niche, but there's plenty of things, and the things have changed over time too, because depending on, all of us started writing a long time ago when people were talking about like specific paths that you would need to take, or you got to get an agent, or you got to do X, Y, and Z. And then around 2014, 2016, the Kindle showed up, the Amazon store, indie publishing became a thing. And people that developed indie publishing started their own publishing houses. And now you've got so-called indie publishers like Aethon or Variant or other places like that outsell the publishers that used to be thought of as that was the gravy train, right? But was it ever the gravy train? So there's a lot to touch on here. And if you're not an author, it might just be interesting to hear the things that we're thinking about as well when you get into this. Is it a calling? Is it a hobby? Is it a torturous slavery that you can never let go of? I don't know.
There's so many niche genres out there, like Weird Western or just smaller genres that aren't necessarily like massive markets, but they're still fun reads and the audience is still there. If that's what you want to do, is write a Weird Western, then do that, and don't force yourself to do, I don't know, hardcore lit RPG progression isekai fantasy. If that's not your thing, don't do it. Because there's so many authors now that gets kind of stuck in writing something that they don't necessarily want to write just because that's what makes them money. And if you're looking to do it as a full-time author, obviously you're going to be doing it for a long time, and you want to be able to carry that and not get burnt out in doing something, like write different series or whatever, different genres. I've written a couple of different genres. I like to spread it out and kind of enjoy the process. And that's, I think, the key is enjoying the process. And it took me a long time to figure mine out, and I'm still kind of tweaking it, but absolutely enjoying it is number one. Everybody says, I don't want to read science fiction, but almost every mainstream billion-dollar blockbuster hit is science fiction. Like, right. It's crazy that everybody's like, I don't like science fiction, but they love the Avengers and they loved Avatar and like all these aliens and all this stuff. Like, so like, I guess my point with that is, if you do get in the business and you write objectively a good book and it doesn't sell, don't take that as a failure. Continue grinding, because that's where it is. It's not like like I have this thing with tattoos where I like having tattoos, but I don't like getting tattoos. If you like having a book, but you don't like writing the book, do something else.
Right. Which is, I think, gets to a point. One point I wanted to bring up that no one else will tell you is like, it's not about the book you just finished. It's about the next. You got to always move on to the next book that you're writing. Sure. Like, you got to write another book, and that's which goes back to what Josh said previously. If you don't enjoy doing this, there are easier ways to make money. Mm-hmm. But the minute that's the best marketing you can do is to write another book. It's the best. It's how you show that you're consistent and can be depended on. And it's just write the next thing. Love the act of writing.
so much bad advice as a writer. I mean, that's kind of a thing that no one does either. You're gonna get so much bad advice from people who act like they know what they're talking about. I mean, you go into Writer Dojo, I could spend all day in Writer Dojo debunking bad advice. And there have been days where I've had to, burr up my hair, and I've done that. And people get really offended, really mad, like, well, who are you? And blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, just go Google me and you'll see who I am. I know what I'm talking about. And it's frustrating to me is that like people talk about, my wife's laughing at me over that statement.
Who are you?
And
you know who I am.
What's frustrating to me is to see people give new writers who want to be successful, who want to make money, who want to succeed, really bad advice, like write what you love, don't worry about the market, or don't worry about the genre, or and to me, writing a good book encompasses all of these things, right? If you don't know who you're writing for when you start writing, you're writing for no one.
All right, welcome to the show. Today we are talking about history, or using historical events as a basis for military science fiction. And y'all have to help remind me so we can make sure we touch on this, but both grand scale transitional battles that you would use probably when mapping out a whole story, and then smaller stories that could be used as sort of like a side quest or something if you're just looking for cool things for characters to do. But also sometimes history is weirder than fiction, so how do we make it believable that an actual historical event would make sense in a story? So Josh, I think you had an example to start to kick off with that you used in Strikers War. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So we were talking about like the major events in military history, battles and wars. And I think we could probably all agree that the majority of, I won't say the majority, but a lot of military sci-fi takes inspiration from like World War II or Vietnam, and in kind of recent years, more of Iraq and Afghanistan kind of thing. In terms of how the theater of war plays out, I like to take inspiration from smaller events on kind of a personal soldier level. And so for Strikers War, it was written in the Galaxy's Edge universe, and the theme of the Order of the Centurion series books was basically the Order of the Centurion was the Medal of Honor for the now I can't even remember what the military unit is called, the Legion. That was their Medal of Honor. And so what I did was I went through all of the Medal of Honor winners from U.S. history and found Dakota Meyer's story and read into that and watched a number of interviews with him. And I loosely based some of the events on Strikers War on some of Dakota Meyer's firsthand accounts of his battle and how he earned the Medal of Honor. And I like really taking some of those personal aspects of war and incorporating them into the story. Not only do I feel like it gives a little bit of credibility to the writing itself, but if obviously those events are shared between multiple people and across services and different battles. And so a lot of those stories, it doesn't matter whether they take place in World War II or Iraq and Afghanistan. On a personal level, all of those soldiers and warfighters on some level have kind of experienced the same thing and experienced the same kind of emotions and different things. And so regardless of the era of military that you served in, if you're reading these books, if I can get those situations and scenarios as close to real life as possible in terms of just impact, then they'll resonate a lot with the veterans that are the readers, and even the readers that aren't veterans, that it'll give them kind of an insight or maybe a taste of what that scenario was like in real life. And I don't know that I in the book, I don't know that I had like an afterword or anything that said, hey, this is based on Dakota Meyer stuff. But I think that I wrote it in such a way that if you were familiar with his story, you could see the link there and the connection there, and kind of trying to pay homage to a guy that was put in a really bad spot and overcame and did what he needed to do to save his guys and to help his guys out. And I think that's important.
Today, we are moving back into movie review land. And we're going to talk about a movie I like to call Live, Die, Repeat, but was actually named Edge of Tomorrow. The book is called Live, Die, Repeat, or I think the manga.
No, the book is called All You Need Is Kill.
All You Need Is Kill. That's right.
Live, Die, Repeat was the tagline.
That's right.
For the trailer.
You know what's funny about that is I went to watch it this morning, and I went on Prime and I did the voice thing, and I was like Edge of Tomorrow, and it came up with the little buy symbol, and I'm like, I know that I own this movie. And so I had to scroll through all of the movies because on the Fire Stick, you can't just get the thing. You've got to scroll all the way through. Scrolled all the way to the end. Live, Die, Repeat. That was the name of it in the thing.
They changed it. They changed it when it came out on home video.
It's like a Berenstain. I feel like, am I crazy? Because I keep thinking of it as that. Because Edge of Tomorrow actually, to criticize something military science fiction related makes me think of romance.
It sounds like a daytime soap opera.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm. It is not, which is probably something in trying to appeal to a wider audience. Like, okay, hey, honey, do you want to watch it?
No, he's always on the edge of tomorrow.
Well,
yes, but it sounds like a daytime soap opera.
Right. It doesn't sound like
that never occurred to me.
Really? It did to me.
I thought it was a perfect title.
I feel like the movie was.
It didn't occur to me too, but Rick has a habit of like ruining my titles. The title for the third Valor book was supposed to be Essence of Valor, and Rick was like, "It sounds like a perfume," and I'm like, "Come on, man! Like, I can't do that."
Come on,
now.
Essence is a load. I don't know.
Ode to Valor.
I'm thinking of something like hair products. Like, okay, so we're gonna watch the trailer. Which I will magically insert into the video here.
Boom.
If you're listening on the podcast, I will probably, I guess we could keep, it's cool to listen to it too, but you might hear some cool sound effects.
You could link it in the notes.
I can link it. So I'll cut it out of the podcast.
It's also a 10-year-old movie at this point.
I can't believe it's been 10 years.
How much fun is it to listen to a trailer, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Right.
But anyway, here's the trailer.
Best trailer ever.
Huge trailer.
Everyone's
huge trailer.
Everyone says
not like the trailers from China.
So I think maybe we could start the conversation about this. Is like this probably is a military science fiction movie that has pretty good crossover value, as far as audience wise. Like I do think it was marketed poorly. Like I actually didn't even know it was in the theaters when it came out, but it's a movie that my wife loves, and I don't know if that's because of the way they set up the characters. It is just kind of a cool, like, you
Groundhog Day meets Aliens.
Exactly. And
I think what happened was it wasn't necessarily the marketing was bad. There was a really big article, I think, I forget in what it was, Forbes or Time or one of them, where they're like, oh, how many times is someone going to remake Groundhog Day? And I think that turned a lot of people off.
I don't remember that article.
I love Groundhog's Day.
Oh, Groundhog Day is one of my favorite movies ever.
But the year this movie came out was a really good year for movies, right? We had Winter Soldier came out the same year. And this is just, Edge of Tomorrow is just one of the best military sci-fi movies. It's right up there with Aliens. It's infinitely quotable. It's emotional. It's funny. It has cool technology. If you haven't seen Edge of Tomorrow, you absolutely should.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because we all love it. So.
Mm-hmm. It is also one of the very few time travel movies that don't really like screw it up, right? Like there's a lot of time
travel, I think, and that's probably why it works so well.
Well, that's what I mean. Like it's not like they're not going back in time; they're just restarting. It's technically not time travel, but they're still playing with time.
Story, because that's one of the first things I noticed. Actually, like thinking about like every branch changes slightly, and then he changes it. I mean, that was one of the things that I started thinking, like, the human mind can't track all this as part of what was throwing me off on some of it, but I just let that go.
Like what? What could you not track?
Track all the steps it takes to change the outcome of a given thing until you...
Yeah, it's funny because I hear
all the time.
It's funny because I get interrupted when I talk all the time. It's funny because I hear people say all the time, not just you. I mean, lots of people that time travel movies confuse them, that they can't keep. And I'm like, I never had that problem. I always able to follow time travel.
Well, it doesn't confuse me, but it's like the new outcomes. You have to remember and follow every new outcome that may or may not happen. And the thing is, every time you change one thing down the road, things change, and the movie doesn't really address that. And that's fine. Like, I didn't really dwell on it, but it is a thing I think about in this kind of story.
Well, he had 2 days, right? He had 2 days. It wasn't really one day that was reliving over and over again. It was 2 days.
We're going to start talking about not why we fight, but why we write. When there are plenty of times to write. If you've been doing this for any amount of time, you're going to realize that there are times of feast and times of famine. Markets change. You get a contract. You don't have a contract. Why do you keep writing, even when this is probably one of the hardest things mentally you can do to make money? And then, as part of that, we'll talk about what our current projects are, which I think is going to really tie into that. Why do you keep writing? And we're fortunate, not to blow too much smoke up Rick's third point of contact, but we're fortunate to have someone who is on like book number 75 now, I think. 78. Yeah, which we could probably have a whole other show about the state of the industry right now, but there are folks working now who have written. There have always been people who have written a lot of books, like Nora Roberts, who's a famous romance writer and also has written some fantasy, has always wrote more than what the industry wanted to publish. I'm digressing here quite a bit, but the industry only ever wanted to publish 2 to 3 books a year. But there are people that are writing a lot, and it's kind of a misnomer that if you write a whole bunch of books, they can't be good books. Like, yes, they can be good books. Nobody says that a carpenter that produces a lot of beautiful cabinetry is a bad carpenter. Or selling out somehow. It's no, you learn to do a skill and you practice the skill.
I like what Metallica said.
Yeah.
Yes, we do sell out. We sell out every single venue we play in.
And I mean, me personally, like, I'm about to turn 50, which that's crazy to me.
Oh, boo-hoo.
I know, but when you think about how much time you have, like, this is another kind of digression too, but maybe we can talk about it later. But you think about, like, in this industry, like, the idea that anybody will remember your name is kind of, ridiculous. That's not, you're lucky if people remember your name for, a year. But you look at somebody like Stephen King and his output, or like Charles Dickens and his output, or Nora Roberts, ultimately the thing that I believe will get a certain writer to have some sort of, lifespan beyond their life of their books is how much they produce. That's always what it comes down to, is how much do you produce? And if you don't have time, or you can't produce, or you don't produce, that I don't know. I think that's the thing that could have a bigger impact. So I don't know, Rick. I feel a lot of times like people just, for whatever reason, like the vagaries of the industry right now, like you in particular, just have not gotten that recognition yet. Or, I mean, to a certain, like, obviously we're talking folks that do know and recognize that. But
remember Lester Dent?
What did he write?
Doc Savage.
Yes. How many
Doc Savage? Buttloads of Doc Savage books. I don't even know how many.
Yeah.
Let me look it up how many, because it was a lot.
Yeah.
How many Doc Savage?
It's interesting that you say you'll be remembered for the
213 or whatever. 213 Doc Savage books.
Yeah. But it's also a well-known fact that you'll be remembered for the books that you didn't write if you don't finish what you're trying to write.
Oh yeah,
that's a given.
That's that's a good place to be, that they're remembering you for not writing your books. But it's not a place that I want to be.
George R.R. Patrick Rothfuss Martin.
100%. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I actually wonder if, we're in the time of AI feeding databases. Like, the more books you write, the more likely you are to live forever in some database somewhere.
A lot of writers were forced to write under pen names. And so, like you said, where they wrote many, many books, a lot of people might not know that their favorite author wrote books from back in the day, just because the nature of publishing that it was and all of that. And I think, we're in a really good time right now where, Rick, you can write, 70 books and you're not forced to only put out one a year or two a year or whatever it is, and people can read them. And I think that people misunderstand the only publishing a book a year model as, like you said, it has to be a good book, or if you write more, then they're not good books, because, writing 2,000 words a day is not hard, especially if this is your whole job.
2,000 words
right?
a day. Yeah.